A racially discriminatory police officer unwarrantedly attacks a black woman, unaware that she is a karate fighter. When she decides to fight back, his face goes pale. What happens when this woman chooses not to remain silent in the face of injustice? This story will make you reflect on justice, courage, and inner strength. Will she be able to overcome oppression, or will she be swallowed by a system that has existed for centuries? Let's dive into this surprising story together. But before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any other inspiring stories. On a beautiful afternoon in Fair Haven, a quiet neighborhood in a large American city, Christmas was just around the corner, and the festive spirit filled the streets. Stores displayed sparkling decorations, and Christmas lights twinkled on every corner. The locals were preparing for the holiday season, excited about family and friend gatherings. Yet, amidst this vibrant scene, a tense and controversial encounter was about to change a woman's and her son's lives forever. Grace Johnson, a woman in her 30s, was a single mother to 13-year-old Peter. She wasn't particularly well known in the community, but she was deeply loved for her calm demeanor, resilience, and kindness. Grace was always concerned about the well-being of those around her and worked tirelessly for a better life for her son. As a devoted mother, she worked hard to raise Peter, teaching him to be kind and strong. Grace had faced many challenges in her life. After her divorce, she took on all the responsibilities of raising Peter independently and dealing with financial and emotional struggles to create a warm and loving home. Despite everything, Grace always kept her faith in herself and the values she instilled in her son. She believed that in a society full of difficulties and discrimination, patience and strength would help her overcome all challenges. Before becoming a single mother, Grace was a black belt karate athlete, which helped her build both physical and mental strength. Her years of training shaped her body and taught her patience, discipline, and how to control her emotions in tense situations. She understood that sometimes strength doesn't just come from muscles, but also from a calm and peaceful soul. Though life presented many challenges, Grace always worked hard to maintain a stable life for Peter. She taught him lessons about fairness, courage, and, most importantly, respect for others. During their shopping trips or community events, she would emphasize that everyone deserved to be treated fairly, regardless of race or background. However, life was not always easy. Grace knew that the world outside could sometimes be unfair, especially for people like her and Peter. A single mother with a son, living in a society still filled with deep prejudices and racism. She never imagined facing even greater challenges, but everything would change one seemingly ordinary day. One day, after a seemingly successful shopping trip, Grace and Peter were loading their shopping bags into the car. The peaceful winter air was suddenly shattered by the sound of a police siren. A police car with flashing lights parked right next to them, followed by a loud announcement from the loudspeaker. Grace turned around in surprise, squinting against the sunlight reflecting off the car windows. She thought something might be wrong, but she had no idea what awaited her. A middle-aged officer, Jack Miller, stepped out of the car with a firm, confident stride, but his face showed a cold, unsettling expression. Jack Miller was no stranger to the people of Fair Haven. He had worked as a police officer in the area for many years and was notorious for his racist behavior and hostility toward minority groups. While many locals felt uneasy seeing him, his position of power made him believe he could do whatever he wanted without fear of criticism. Rumors about him frequently circulated in the community, that he didn't like black people and always found ways to make life difficult for those who were different from him. Grace had never faced a situation like this before. She had lived in Fairhaven for years, and although she knew there were underlying societal issues, she had never experienced direct discrimination or injustice herself. But now, as she saw Officer Miller stepping out of the police car, Grace could feel a chilling atmosphere settling around them. Miller walked toward them with an air of challenge. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice harsh, with no hint of kindness. Surprised by the officer's sudden appearance, Grace tried to remain calm. She turned to Peter, noticing the worry etched on his face, but Grace knew that in moments like this, staying composed was the most important thing. She smiled gently and explained, "We've just finished shopping. There's nothing unusual going on." Miller stared at her, narrowing his eyes as if trying to determine whether she was telling the truth. "Do you have any ID? Show me your ID." His voice became colder and more aggressive. Grace was taken aback by this request. She couldn't understand why she, a woman simply out shopping, was being asked to show her papers. She had never faced such treatment before, especially in a neighborhood like Fairhaven, where she had lived for so long. "I haven't done anything wrong. I was just shopping normally," Grace replied, keeping her calm, though inside she was starting to feel anxious. Miller didn't listen to her explanation. "You seem suspicious," he said, his gaze filled with doubt. "I need to check your ID immediately." These words hit Grace like a punch in the stomach. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. It felt like an unsettling wave of anxiety rising within her. She had done nothing wrong, but now she was facing a police officer who seemed ready to make false assumptions. All she wanted was to go home with Peter and finish their peaceful shopping trip. Peter stood by, holding his phone, his eyes still focused on the officer with concern. He could feel the tension in the air and knew things were escalating. Seeing his mother being threatened, Peter quickly pulled out his phone and started recording the scene. Even though he was young, he understood the importance of capturing everything in situations like this. He feared something might happen, and, at least, if things got out of hand, the video would serve as evidence. Grace turned to Peter, noticing the fear in his eyes, but she forced a smile to reassure him. "Keep the phone there. I'm fine," she whispered, though inside she was anything but fine. Miller paid no attention to Peter's intervention. He just stared at Grace with a challenging look, as if testing whether she would bow to his authority. With his demeanor becoming more aggressive, he took a step closer to Grace, unexpectedly yanked her arm, and said, "I told you to show me your ID right now. I don't have time for this questioning game." Grace felt those words like a sharp blow to her heart. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but the attitude of this officer was becoming increasingly dangerous. In her mind, terrible images began to flash. Was she going to be arrested for no reason? What would happen to Peter if things spiraled out of control? She couldn't let this situation escalate any further. She looked down at Peter's phone in his hand, realizing that he was recording, the light from the screen casting a glow on his face where the worry was visible. Peter stood next to his mother, his hands trembling, but he was determined to keep the camera rolling. He could feel the anger in the officer's voice and the injustice his mother was facing. Grace looked at Peter, her gaze soft but resolute. "Okay, keep recording. You're doing the right thing," she whispered, her voice calm but clear. Although she didn't want the situation to escalate, she knew that having evidence in moments like this was crucial. Her heart ached at the thought of her son witnessing this. But no matter what, she wasn't going to face the injustice alone, especially with Peter standing beside her. Meanwhile, Officer Miller didn't ease up on his tough stance. He stood close to Grace, almost invading her personal space, one hand still gripping her shoulder. "I told you to show your ID. If you don't cooperate, I'll have to take further action," Miller said, his hand roughly searching through Grace's handbag as if looking for any reason to accuse her. Grace's heart raced, a wave of unease spreading through her body. Though she had mentally prepared for tense situations, this was more than she could control. "I haven't done anything wrong. You don't have the right to search my belongings." Grace spoke up, trying to keep her voice steady, though the firmness in her words was unmistakable. Miller wouldn't listen. He showed no intention of backing down, and his attitude only hardened. He paused briefly, looking around as if expecting backup from his colleagues. However, the area around them was relatively quiet, with only a few shoppers walking by, but they all stopped and watched the scene unfold. Grace could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, but she couldn't just stand there. She had to do something to protect her and Peter's rights. She knew this confrontation might not end there. If Miller wouldn't back off, she could be facing something much worse. But despite the growing anxiety, Grace couldn't retreat. She had learned to stay calm in difficult situations, and now she had to do it once more. The tension in the air was palpable. People around them started to stop, quietly watching the developments. Some even pulled out their phones to record the incident, and others began murmuring among themselves. This wasn't just a standoff between Grace and the officer. It was becoming a challenge for everyone witnessing it. The eyes of Fair Haven's residents seemed focused on the event, as if they were waiting for someone to step up and do what was right. At this moment, Peter was no longer just an observer. He could feel the tension and didn't want his mother to face the brutality alone. He saw the officer rummaging through her handbag, and his concern deepened. "Mom, are you okay?" Peter asked, his voice trembling but filled with determination. Grace turned to look at Peter, offering him a soft smile, trying to reassure him. "I'm fine, don't worry. I just need a moment to explain," she said, though deep inside, she wasn't sure how the situation would resolve. But she had no choice but to remain calm and hold her ground. Just then, Officer Miller seemed to realize that things weren't going according to plan. The witnesses were beginning to take notice, and the shift in the atmosphere made it impossible for him to continue his aggressive behavior. Instead of backing down, however, he simply challenged Grace. "What do you think you can do? You're not going to win this." And that was when everything was about to reach a climax, where Grace's next move would change everything. As the tension mounted, Grace held her ground, her gaze fixed firmly on Officer Miller as she refused to back down. But at that moment, a new figure emerged from the crowd, causing an unexpected disruption. Tom, a middle-aged resident, stepped forward and looked at Grace with a judgmental expression. He didn't seem to be one for confrontations like this. With a tone of contempt, Tom spoke up. "People like you never know when to keep quiet. Let the police do their job." Tom's words hit Grace's patience like a blow, and they made the situation even more complicated. The people around them began to split into two groups, some looking at Tom with agreement, while others started to feel uncomfortable with his brashness and the officer's actions. The looks of the bystanders grew more complicated. Some, having witnessed Miller's aggressive attitude, turned to support Grace. Others looked at Tom with irritation, feeling like he was endorsing wrong behavior. The sense of injustice in the air became even more apparent. However, amid this intense moment, another woman, Sarah, emerged from the far end of the parking lot. Sarah, a resident known for her openness and enthusiasm, couldn't stand by and watch this unfold. She knew Grace and Peter, though they were just neighbors, and they had exchanged greetings a few times. Sarah couldn't stand the sight of this injustice. She walked over, her gaze determined yet gentle, exuding strength. Sarah gave Tom a look before turning to Grace and offering her a reassuring smile. "Grace, stay calm," Sarah said in a gentle but firm voice. "Don't let them hurt you. I know you're a good person. You have nothing to fear." Sarah's appearance was like a breath of fresh air in this tense situation. She wasn't just a passive observer. She spoke up to defend Grace, making her position clear. "Officer Miller, your attitude is unacceptable," Sarah said loudly so the crowd could hear. "No one has the right to treat a citizen like this, especially when they haven't done anything wrong." Sarah's words caused the atmosphere to settle slightly. Some of the onlookers began to look at Sarah with approval. A few nodded in agreement, while others turned away, feeling embarrassed as they realized the unfairness in the officer's behavior. Tom, who had just defended Miller, seemed a bit confused by Sarah's clear support. He didn't want to make things more complicated, but he couldn't stop reacting. "You don't understand," Tom responded, his eyes narrowed at Sarah. "The police are doing their job. You all should just stand here and mind your business." "Tom," Sarah shot back, her voice steady, full of resolve. "Is this how we want the next generation to see the police? Through actions like this? We have to be role models for our kids, not spewing hatred and discrimination." The change in Sarah's attitude began to draw the attention of others around them. A few more people started to speak up in support of Grace, and the situation began to shift. Small conversations started spreading through the crowd, with people nearby criticizing Miller's behavior. Grace could feel the support from Sarah, and inside she felt somewhat reassured. She was no longer alone in this situation. The people around her were no longer just passers-by. They were starting to stand by her. The neighbors, those who had witnessed the scene, seemed to have woken up to the injustice unfolding before them. Peter stood by his mother, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. He kept filming, but now he felt that the worry in his chest had eased somewhat. It wasn't just a standoff between his mother and the officer anymore. It was a sense that the people around them, especially Sarah, were standing up for what was right. The situation was still tense, but Sarah's appearance had created a crucial turning point in the context. She wasn't just an ally to Grace, but also a leader in challenging discrimination and injustice. This support wasn't just comforting, it was a powerful act, forcing the others in the crowd to reconsider what they were witnessing. At this point, Officer Miller began to feel the pressure. He hadn't expected such strong community support. All eyes were on him, and the doubt in the minds of the witnesses was becoming more obvious. But Miller, with his hot-headedness and arrogance, still didn't realize that his power was slowly slipping away. The tension in the air was steadily escalating. Although Sarah and others in the crowd had voiced their opposition to the officer's behavior, Miller seemed determined not to back down. Sarah's presence, along with the support from those around her, failed to sway him. On the contrary, it only seemed to make him angrier and more defensive. Officer Miller, with a tense expression, could not tolerate being challenged right in front of him. As those around them began speaking out, Miller turned to glare at them with hostility. But then, he turned back without a word and immediately took action. He moved toward Grace, roughly grabbed her arm and dragged her toward the car. "What do you think you can do to me?" Miller shouted, the strength in his voice and gestures only intensified, becoming more aggressive. Grace flinched as she felt the pressure of the officer's hand on her arm. The pain from his tight grip made her dizzy, but she refused to let fear take over. At that moment, she recalled the years of karate training and the self-defense techniques she had learned. She knew that if she didn't resist immediately, the situation would spiral out of control, and she wouldn't be able to protect herself or Peter. "Miller, let go of me!" Grace shouted, her voice clear and decisive. "You have no right to do this." She used all her strength to twist her body, but Miller refused to release her. She could feel his anger, his overwhelming dominance. But even though her body was being pulled toward the car, her mind remained sharp and alert. Peter, though standing not far from his mother, could do nothing but record the video. He saw his mother being yanked away and couldn't control his emotions. "Mom! Mom!" Peter cried, his eyes red and filled with worry and fear. He wanted to run over, to do something to help her, but he knew he couldn't. He couldn't let things get out of hand, and he couldn't make the situation worse. Grace, although terrified, did not let the fear take over. She took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. She had been through many challenges in life, and this was not the first time she had to face a threat. She had learned to use both her physical strength and mind to protect herself, and now she would need to do it once again. With a quick motion, Grace used her free hand to push hard on Miller's arm, causing him to lose his balance momentarily. She then fought back more forcefully, twisting her body and using the arm-locking technique she had learned in karate to escape his hold. But as soon as she made this move, the officer yelled in anger, "Don't resist!" He yanked her harder, this time not only grabbing her arm but also shoving her against the car, making her feel the force of the impact. Grace felt pain, but she did not back down. For her, this was not just a struggle for herself, but also a fight for her son's rights and for everyone who had suffered from discrimination and oppression. "What right do you have to treat me like this?" she screamed, her voice firm and full of strength. "I'm not a criminal. I haven't done anything wrong." The crowd around them was becoming increasingly tense. Some of the witnesses began standing up quietly. Some took out their phones to record the scene. Others began whispering to each other, unable to bear the injustice Grace was facing. Sarah, although standing at a distance, could no longer stand by. She quickly walked toward them but hesitated, fearing that getting involved now might escalate the situation further. Peter, seeing his mother treated this way, felt a surge of anger rise within him. He could no longer stand there doing nothing. He moved closer, knowing that he couldn't do much, but he had to show that he wasn't afraid, that his mother wasn't alone. "Mom, you're okay," he shouted, trying to maintain his composure despite his intense fear. The atmosphere in the parking lot seemed to freeze. All eyes were on Miller, Grace, and Peter. The whispers grew louder, and at that moment, Miller began to feel a shift in the air. This was no longer just a confrontation between him and Grace. It had become a confrontation with the community. Miller still wouldn't back down, but his confidence was beginning to wane. Everything was slowly spiraling out of his control. In that tense moment, when Grace's patience was running out, she sensed that this was the time she couldn't just stand still and endure. Miller's resistance made her realize that the only way she could protect herself and her son was to act swiftly and decisively. With a natural reflex, Grace seized the opportunity when she felt Miller grab her hand again. She remembered the long hours of karate training she had gone through. Despite a long time without practice, the training had become ingrained in her subconscious and body, allowing her to react quickly and effectively. With a swift and precise move, Grace turned her body, bending her hand slightly to the side while simultaneously using her foot to gently push into Miller's hip. The force of the push caught Miller off guard, and in that brief moment, he lost his balance. Grace immediately seized the chance, breaking free from his stiff grip and using her elbow and knee to create some distance. Miller, unable to believe what had just happened, staggered a few steps back, his eyes wide with confusion. Grace did not miss the opportunity. She stood firm, her gaze resolute and unafraid. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said loudly, staring straight at Miller, unwavering. The crowd began to murmur, many still standing by watching, but the atmosphere in the area had shifted. Some of them began turning to each other, whispering. This was no longer just a matter between a woman and a police officer. It had become a symbol of resistance against the abuse of power. Peter, standing next to his mother, felt an electric current surge through him. He had never seen his mother so strong. What was happening made him proud, but also filled with worry. He continued recording everything on his phone, knowing this was the only evidence to protect his mother and prove that what Miller was doing was wrong. He couldn't let his mother suffer this cruelty without clear validation. "Mom, are you okay?" Peter asked, his voice full of concern, but his eyes remained fixed on the scene in front of him. He knew that even though he was afraid, he had to stay calm. He had to prove that they were right in this fight. The presence of the phone in Peter's hand was crucial, not only for recording evidence but also for increasing the pressure on the officer. Miller now had to face not only a resilient mother but also the scrutiny from the community around him, and the evidence Peter was gathering. The tension in the crowd was rising, as the witnesses began to realize that Grace wasn't just protecting herself. She was standing up for something bigger: justice and fairness. The sense of losing control was evident on Miller's face as he realized he could not overpower Grace as he had hoped. Although Miller hadn't fully grasped how the situation was changing, with every passing moment, he felt the pressure from the crowd and the actions of Grace. Grace's strong and unexpected resistance made it impossible for everyone present not to take notice. Many in the crowd began speaking up, some expressing dissatisfaction with the officer's actions, while others continued to watch in silence, but their gazes had shifted. They couldn't ignore the fact that Grace's actions were not just a simple defense move, but a confrontation with the injustice unfolding right before their eyes. As some people in the crowd started speaking out in support of Grace and criticizing Miller's behavior, the atmosphere suddenly changed. The sense of community support began to spread, and this support seemed to give Grace even more strength. She felt the mental power of those around her, fueling her resolve. Miller, still shaken by Grace's sudden resistance, felt the frustration and anger rise within him. He stood upright, one hand on his head, the other relaxed by his side. The officer no longer had the same confidence as before, his eyes full of anxiety, realizing that Grace and the community would not be easily subdued. Though he still tried to maintain composure, the signs of his unease were becoming more evident. The entire crowd now understood that this confrontation was not just a struggle for Grace, but a battle for power, fairness, and the rights of every individual in society. Miller's face turned bright red with anger, his eyes flashing with hatred and wounded pride. He could not bear being defied by a woman. The tension in the air thickened as he realized that it wasn't just Grace, but the whole community, who was beginning to turn against his actions. Refusing to lose in this confrontation, Miller decided to use more force. He pulled the baton from his belt, the long metal rod gleaming in the afternoon light. The sound of clang rang out as he drew the baton, and the silence in the crowd made it clear that the situation was about to become extremely dangerous. "Don't think you can beat me," Miller yelled, his voice full of rage, before swinging the baton towards Grace. A sense of fear swept through the crowd. Many people held their breath, unable to believe that the police officer was about to use force against a woman and her son. Sarah, standing nearby, clenched her fists, her eyes fixed on every move Grace and Miller made. Some people in the crowd secretly took out their phones, recording the event, while others exchanged worried glances. Grace saw the baton swing from Miller, Faced with this attack, she didn't panic but focused intently on every movement of the officer. Over the years of karate training, she had learned how to react quickly and handle pressure in any situation. Now was the moment for everything she had learned to come into play. Miller shouted as he swung the baton at high speed, trying to strike Grace. She observed every motion and responded immediately. First, she twisted her body to the side, causing the baton to fly past her without making contact. Then she quickly stepped back, using her hands to block the next swing, making the baton miss and causing Miller to lose his balance. Each time Miller attempted to strike with the baton, Grace displayed excellent movements to dodge or block. She remained calm while facing danger, her sharp eyes tracking every move of her opponent. In truth, no one could have guessed that an ordinary woman like Grace could handle the situation with such calmness and decisiveness. One strong swing from Miller caused him to lose control of the baton's force, and Grace immediately swept her leg across, causing him to stagger. The crowd began to stir, those who had been standing still now inching closer, their gazes shifting from fear to admiration. They realized that Grace was not someone easily defeated. Miller, after several unsuccessful baton swings, became even angrier. Sweat began to form on his body, and his arrogance and confidence were completely gone. He was no longer a strong officer with power in his hands, but just a man struggling to overpower a woman he could not defeat. "Don't mess with me," Miller roared, this time not only swinging the baton, but also trying to shove Grace into the car to gain an advantage. But Grace quickly dodged, using her arms and legs to maintain her distance. Each strike she made caused Miller to stagger and lose his balance. Outside, the crowd was witnessing the increasingly tense situation. Miller's shouts, Grace's heavy breaths, and the sounds of baton strikes against the air created a scene full of tension. No one remained silent. Some started calling for other police officers, some hurried to record videos, and many began shouting their support for Grace. Peter stood right next to her, his phone still tightly gripped. He witnessed everything, unable to believe his eyes as his mother resisted so strongly, facing the violence of a police officer. Though worried, his mother's resilience inspired him, and he knew he had to keep recording everything to ensure that justice would prevail. In the most intense moment, Miller swung the baton at Grace with all his might, but she was ready. She used her leg to strike the baton, knocking it from Miller's hand and causing him to lose his footing and stumble backward. The crowd let out a collective sigh of relief and some began to clap, realizing that Grace had successfully pushed back the violent officer. Miller's change in demeanor was clear. He couldn't believe he had been defeated by a woman. A sense of shame and failure surged within him, but he also knew that his career and reputation would never be the same if he didn't stop now. Miller staggered backward after the strong counterattack from Grace, his eyes flashing with both anger and confusion. The crowd, which had been silently observing, now began reacting more visibly. A few people, no longer able to stand idly by, began speaking up in support of Grace. "That's right. Stand up for yourself," a young man yelled from behind the crowd, raising his phone to record the whole situation. Others followed suit, the sound of camera shutters and the flashes of phone cameras lighting up the area. An elderly woman, standing near her car, shook her head in disbelief. "How shameful! A police officer acting like this?" she shouted, drawing the attention of those around her. Support for Grace in the crowd started to increase. A few people began clapping, while others shouted in protest at Miller's actions. The shift in the crowd's attitude not only encouraged Grace, but also put pressure on Miller. He was no longer just facing Grace. Now, he was up against a community that was gradually siding with her. Sarah, standing at the front of the crowd, remained steadfast and continued to cheer Grace on. She looked at Grace with encouraging eyes. "Grace, you're doing great. Don't let him push you around," she called out loud enough for Grace to hear. Sarah, although not directly involved in the confrontation, was providing strong moral support. Tom, who had previously defended Miller, was now starting to feel uneasy. He stood still, watching the unfolding events with an uncertain expression. At first, Tom believed Miller was just doing his job, but after seeing his actions, especially the use of the baton to attack Grace, Tom realized that things were not as he had thought. Tom slowly moved closer to Sarah, his gaze filled with doubt. I think I was wrong," he admitted, his voice lowering. "I didn't think it would go this far. The police shouldn't be doing this." Sarah turned around, her eyes softening as she saw the change in Tom's attitude. "Recognizing the mistake is a good thing, Tom. But what matters now is what we do to fix it," she said calmly but firmly. "We can't stand by and let this continue." Tom nodded, as if Sarah's words had awakened something in him. He pulled out his phone and began recording, just like many others in the crowd. This small action marked an important shift in his perception. Meanwhile, Grace stood firm, her breath heavy but her gaze still determined. She could feel the support from those around her, and it gave her strength. She looked at Peter, who was still recording with unwavering focus. "I'm fine, Peter. Keep filming," she said, her voice still strong, even as her body began to tire. The crowd continued to cheer for Grace, and this support was not just encouragement, but a reaffirmation that she was not alone in this fight. The cheers, the words of encouragement, and even the change in attitude from people like Tom painted a clear picture. This was not just a confrontation between Grace and Miller, but a battle between injustice and justice, between abuse of power and courage. Miller, realizing that the situation was shifting, began to feel the pressure weighing on him. The arrogance in his eyes faded, replaced by concern as he realized he no longer had control of the situation. But instead of stopping, he continued to try to reclaim his power, unaware that he was only digging himself further into a corner. The tension between Grace and Officer Miller showed no signs of easing, and the situation was spiraling further out of control. The crowd around them grew denser. Murmurs of conversation buzzed through the air, and the glowing screens of phones continued to capture the scene. Just as Miller realized he could not escalate his actions further without facing severe backlash, additional police vehicles began to arrive in the distance. The shrill sirens of the approaching patrol cars cut through the tense atmosphere as they screeched to a halt. The newly arrived officers stepped out to witness the scene before them. Miller, who was supposedly on duty, sat slumped on the ground, his face bruised and filled with humiliation. Meanwhile, Grace, a petite but fearless woman, stood tall in the middle of the parking lot, her sharp gaze unflinching, showing no signs of fear or regret. The officers, unaware of the full context, exchanged puzzled glances. One among them, dressed in the sergeant's uniform, stepped forward and gestured for the others to hold back. Sergeant Davis, his expression a mixture of authority and concern, surveyed the scene. His eyes settled on Miller before shifting to Grace, who remained composed and unwavering. "Ma'am," Davis began, his voice calm but firm, "can you explain to me what happened here?" Grace shot another glance at Miller before replying with measured clarity. "We were shopping and returning to our car when Officer Miller demanded my identification, without any justifiable reason. When I refused, he used force and tried to arrest me. I had no choice but to defend myself," she stated, her voice steady and unhesitating. At that moment, Peter, who had been recording everything on his phone, stepped closer to Davis and handed him the device. "This video shows everything," the boy said, his voice trembling slightly but laced with determination. Davis began watching the video. It documented the entire sequence of events, from Miller approaching Grace and demanding her ID, to the escalating confrontation, and, finally, to Grace's self-defense. Every movement Grace made was deliberate and controlled, while Miller's actions became increasingly erratic and aggressive. As Davis watched, his expression shifted from doubt to understanding and, ultimately, to disappointment in his colleague. When the video ended, Davis looked back at Grace, and his demeanor changed. "You've done nothing wrong. This is clear," he said, his voice steady but laced with respect. "Officer Miller will be investigated for his actions." Miller, still sitting on the ground, avoided meeting Davis's gaze. He looked down, his body slumped, his posture exuding exhaustion and shame. His failure was not just in his confrontation with Grace, but also in losing the trust of his community and colleagues. The other officers, having heard Davis's words, began to grasp the gravity of the situation. They exchanged looks before stepping forward to assist Grace and Peter. One of them approached Grace and asked softly, "Is there anything we can do to help you?" Grace gave a faint smile, her composure unwavering. "Thank you. I just want this matter to be resolved fairly." After carefully reviewing the video and hearing testimony from the witnesses, Davis decided to take immediate action. As a police officer, he knew that the abuse of power and improper conduct could not be tolerated. Davis took another long look at the phone screen, his expression stern. He turned back to Miller, who remained on the ground, his face blank with despair. "Officer Miller," Davis said, his voice calm but resolute, "your actions today are unacceptable. After reviewing the video and hearing the accounts of witnesses, I am initiating an internal investigation into this incident." Miller, still sitting in a daze, was beyond offering any defense or excuses. He kept his head low, avoiding the eyes of Davis and everyone else present. His professional pride was shattered before the public's eyes, and now he lacked the energy to fight back or mask his fear. "Being a police officer doesn't give you the right to act this way," Davis continued, his gaze sweeping across the other officers, who stood at a slight distance, observing the situation. "Effective immediately, Officer Miller. You are suspended pending the outcome of this investigation." The announcement of Miller's suspension landed like a thunderclap, breaking through the thick tension. It was a declaration that shattered any illusion of control Miller still thought he had. Now, there was nothing left for him to cling to. The crowd began moving closer, some murmuring to each other, while others continued recording. Many eyes were fixed on Miller, their expressions a mix of disapproval and disappointment. Some onlookers could no longer contain their outrage and openly voiced their criticism. "He doesn't deserve to wear that badge," one man shouted from the crowd. "We don't need people like him in our police force." Davis heard the outcry but remained focused on his duty. While he was part of the police force himself, he knew that standing up for justice meant holding even his colleagues accountable. Miller, unable to respond, only lowered his head further. He felt crushed under the weight of the public scrutiny, the judgment of his peers, and the silent strength of Grace, the woman whose dignity he had tried to trample. After delivering his verdict, Davis turned back to Grace, his tone softer but no less firm. "Thank you for your patience. We will do everything necessary to ensure that justice is served," he said, his voice carrying a note of respect. Grace gave him a faint but resolute smile. It was not a smile of joy, but one of peace, knowing that the truth had prevailed. She nodded, her gaze steady. "I just want what's right to be done," she replied. Peter, standing beside his mother, looked up at Davis with gratitude. The boy didn't just see a courageous mother, he saw the possibility of societal change, where justice and truth could prevail. Davis gave Miller one last glance before signaling for the other officers to escort him away. Miller was led out of the area, silent and defeated. Meanwhile, Grace and Peter stood firm, showing no signs of fear, only a quiet relief that their fight for truth had not been in vain. As the police continued documenting the incident, the crowd began to disperse, but no one would forget what had happened. This was not merely an event of a mother standing up to abuse and discrimination. It was a powerful reminder of the strength of resilience, the unity of a community, and the enduring belief in justice. The story of Grace Johnson, since the tense event occurred, has become a powerful symbol of courage and justice. Right after the incident, news about the confrontation between Grace and Officer Miller quickly spread across social media and local news. The image of a calm yet resilient single mother standing up against injustice captured the attention of the community, not only in Fair Haven but nationwide. Grace did not seek attention or fame. She simply wanted to protect her son and keep her family safe in a situation she felt was unjust. However, her story touched the hearts of thousands, especially women who had experienced similar situations or people from minority communities who often felt they were treated unfairly. The community began to realize that Grace was not only a resilient mother, but she was also a role model for courage in a world still rife with prejudice and discrimination. Many non-governmental organizations and human rights groups invited Grace to participate in talks, workshops, and community events. She was invited to schools to share her story with students, encouraging them to stand up against injustice and teaching them about their rights in society. Grace became not only a role model for her son, Peter, but also a spiritual mother for many people in the community, inspiring them to face life's challenges. Other parents came to thank her for teaching them about resilience and determination. For Grace, receiving respect and gratitude from others was not what she initially sought, but she understood that her story had a far-reaching and significant impact. Meanwhile, Officer Miller, who caused the incident, faced a different struggle. He not only had to face criticism from the community but also serious consequences for his career and reputation. After being suspended, he felt the divide between himself and his colleagues, who also began questioning his actions. Miller, although initially frustrated and in denial about his mistakes, could not avoid reassessing his behavior. In a meeting with superiors, after a thorough review of his violations, Miller realized that he had done something wrong and could no longer ignore the issues of racism within the police force. An important part of Miller's self-reflection was participating in ethics and anti-racism training. These classes not only helped him learn about issues of inequality in society, but also provided real-life scenarios, helping officers better understand how they could behave more fairly and humanely in their work. Miller began to realize that being a police officer was not just about enforcing the law, but also about ensuring the rights of all citizens, regardless of race, gender, or background. Miller truly understood that his ignorance of issues related to racism and injustice had led him to take thoughtless actions. These ethics courses not only helped him recognize his wrongdoings, but also provided practical solutions to change how he worked. This learning process was not easy, but Miller was committed to correcting his mistakes and becoming a better police officer. While this was not enough to erase the stain on Miller's career, it was an important first step in correcting his actions. More importantly, the shift in his awareness also showed that even in difficult situations, if we dare to confront and fix our mistakes, change can still happen. Grace's story didn't stop there. After the event, she began participating in community activities, becoming an advocate for women and children in need. She founded a support group for women facing discrimination in similar situations, helping them regain self-confidence and stand up for their rights. Grace also began collaborating with NGOs to raise awareness about social issues, particularly racial and gender discrimination in police forces. As a mother, Grace always remembered that no matter how tough life got, she had to set an example for her son. She taught Peter about the value of justice, resilience, and how to stand up when seeing something wrong. And most importantly, she taught him that even though the world may not be perfect, we can still do what is right. The story of Grace and Miller is not just about a tense confrontation between a mother and a police officer. It is a story about change, about facing one's mistakes, and about resilience in life. Grace and Miller, each in their own way, proved that change is possible, and sometimes great mistakes can turn into opportunities for growth. Through this story, the Fairhaven community saw not only the strength of a woman facing discrimination, but also the capacity for personal learning and change, even in the face of grave mistakes. Grace became a beacon for those fighting for justice, and Miller, though it was difficult, was slowly improving himself to become a more just police officer. Their story will continue to inspire future generations, reminding us that sometimes we need to stand up not only for ourselves, but for a fairer society. One day, the community where she lived held ceremonies and discussions to honor Grace's actions, not only for defending herself but also for standing up against social injustice. Her story empowered many, especially women and those from minority groups, to feel more confident about speaking out against discrimination and oppression. Grace continued her work, but now she had a new mission: to inspire those who wanted to change society. She not only taught Peter about strength, perseverance, and courage, but also about the importance of fairness and tolerance. Peter, although he had witnessed a horrible situation with his mother, learned an important lesson from Grace's resilience about how to face adversity and always defend what is right, even if it means risking his safety. Each day, Grace's neighbors, friends, and colleagues admired her more. Grace's story was incorporated into school curriculums as an example of women's strength in modern society. She became a role model not only for her son, but for the young people in the community, encouraging them to act when they see injustice and to fight for their rights and the rights of others. Grace's story also contributed to change in the Fairhaven community. Groups that had previously been passive or silent about racial discrimination began seeking ways to make a difference. Human rights organizations and anti-racism groups began organizing discussions, workshops, and community events to raise awareness about these issues. Thanks to Grace, the Fairhaven community began to face and openly discuss social problems that they had previously avoided. Miller, after being suspended and undergoing ethics training, had to face the consequences of his actions. However, his story didn't end there. Instead of closing himself off in shame and regret, Miller decided to confront his past and find ways to atone for his mistakes. He began attending courses on racism and ethical discussions about police work. He realized that racism was not only harmful to victims but also a stain on his career, and to be a better officer, he had to work on changing his perception. Miller, although starting his journey of correcting his mistakes with many challenges, did not give up. He participated in citizen rights workshops and collaborated with human rights organizations, striving to improve relations between the police and the community. He became a speaker about personal change, encouraging colleagues to learn and change their approach to work. Although the process of change was not easy, the small steps Miller took prove that anyone can learn, correct their mistakes, and become a better version of themselves. Throughout this process, even those who had been opponents of Grace, such as Tom, who initially sided with the police, changed. Initially, Tom viewed the situation from a neutral perspective, but after witnessing Miller's actions and hearing perspectives from Sarah and others in the community, he began to reconsider his view of social issues. Tom began to participate in discussions on racism and awareness of everyone's rights, gradually changing his attitude and perspective. Grace's story changed not only her life, but also the lives of those around her. Ultimately, the story of Grace and Miller is not just about confrontation, but also about change and the opportunity for redemption. Grace was not only the victor in a tense encounter, but also the person who helped change an entire community. She became a symbol not only for her courage in that situation, but also for her perseverance throughout her journey for rights and justice. Today, Grace's story continues to be told as a lesson in strength, perseverance, and courage. The changes stemming from her story continue to spread, not only in Fair Haven but in many other places. Grace didn't just change her own life. She helped change a community, and more importantly, she helped many people realize that everyone can change if they are determined to learn and correct their mistakes. Grace and Peter continue to live their lives, but their story will always be an inspiration for all those who fight for what is right, for justice, and for a society free of discrimination. Grace and Peter will always be a model of strength, resilience, and courage within each of us. The story of Grace and Miller is not just about a confrontation between an individual and power, but also a powerful reminder of the strength of resilience, courage, and the ability to change. What do you think about how Grace handled the situation? Could you stand up for justice like she did? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you love this story and want to hear more inspiring stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any interesting videos in the future. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next stories.